Hello. A few people have indicated that they would be interested in knowing a little bit more about me and my life and my history. So be careful what you wish for. I thought that the idea wasn't entirely without appeal, and I thought I might have a little bash at it. It will be interesting to see what I can remember because a lot of my early childhood I have repressed unknowingly and never really gone into it that or investigated it in any way. I've just accepted that that's the way it is. And the other reason that my memory might not be pin sharp is that later in my adult life, I had the misfortune to be taken drunk surprisingly often. So this could be interesting. I should warn you that some sensitive topics are likely to come up, so some level of viewer discretion is advised, and apologies if anything that I discuss is upsetting to anybody in any way. Okay, let's do this. Welcome to A Potted History of Boaty.
The YouTube channel's not any good, but he's a nice guy. I'm sorry, Mr. Bolton.
Sorry about that. Right, my mum. What a woman. What a hell of a woman. And my best friend in the world, and I miss her every second of every day. But I'm grateful to have had her. Okay, this is where we're going to get into some sensitive subjects. So, um, again, discretion advised. Apologies if this subject matter upsets anybody. But it is what it is. It was part of her. It's part of me. It's part. So need to talk about it. It's also part of what I've repressed. My mother was. My mother came to be because of a rape. My grandmother, my maternal grandmother, who was, I don't know what the term would be these days, the politically correct term, fully functional, but just a little bit simple, little bit naive. The lift didn't quite go to the old top story, and she was in London working as a nanny, and she ended up being raped by a visiting Bermudan Test cricketer, who I've got no idea who he was. Nobody knows who he was. We know that much. We know that he was apparently a lawyer or a barrister when he wasn't cricketing or, I suppose, raping. If I had to guess, I would guess that it was what is now called a date rape. I would, and this is pure speculation on my part. I can imagine that my maternal grandmother found herself in a position through naivety and not being terribly world aware, where she was somewhat taken advantage of. And I absolutely know that you can never apportion any blame for any form of non-consensual sex. Was that a Freudian slip there? I'll find out when I play it back. You can never apportion any blame to the woman. You just can't. It's an abhorrent act. the most reprehensible taking of another human being's dignity and privacy, and oh, I mean, it's just horrible, isn't it? But I can imagine that, how can I put it, that she was probably more vulnerable and prone than most. So anyway, it happened, and 9 months later, my mother was born. And given that her mother was white, from a white family in Middle England, and the father was most decidedly black, then my mother unsurprisingly came out as half-caste, which was a problem in Middle England, and it was a problem for the family. She had nothing going for her. She was oh God. Well, she was what used to be called a bastard, in that she was the product of unmarried parents. She would have been, no doubt, an incredible embarrassment, but worst of all, in those times when racism was much more of a thing than it is now, and God knows it hasn't gone away, but, you know, we're talking about an era where her family were, they'd never seen a black person or a person of colour. And there were signs up all over the place, no Irish, no blacks, no dogs, all of that sort of thing was going on. And she came into the world, bless her, a little half-caste baby with a mother who couldn't cope. So she was actually raised by her grandmother. So there's a dysfunctional beginning, but I have nothing to do with my mother's family. And when I tell you this, you'll understand why. My mother's uncle, my great uncle, was kind of the black sheep of the family, in that, rather unfortunately for them, he was a paedophile, and a very prolific paedophile. He got himself into the position that paedophiles tend to like to. He was the local scout leader. He ran the local junior sports team, so on and so on and so on. And in those days, it was known, it was widely known, but nothing was ever done about it. And I know it wasn't just in that case. It was a thing. It was a bloody thing when I was growing up, let alone when Mum was growing up. And so the family decided, in their fucking wisdom, that the best thing to do would be to give this paedophile my mother, on the basis that he might then leave their kids alone. And I'm afraid that's exactly what happened. My mother was given to him as a plaything from, I won't even tell you what age it all started, because it's utterly, utterly sick. And sadly, the tradition continued, because in times to come, then my brother, and certainly 100%, I know my brother succumbed to the same fate, and as we'll come on to later on, my brother is no longer with us. He died aged 13, and I'm pretty sure that I did too, but that whole part of my life is very much repressed, and I don't really know. Possibly it didn't happen with me. Possibly my father was enough to save me from that. I honestly just don't know. But that's what happened with Mum. God bless her, and God curse him. The bastard lived to a ripe old age, well into his 90s. And made all of the local media, when he did die and when he was buried, as a local hero and all of that bollocks. Don't even go there. And this is why I have nothing to do with that side of my family. I don't recognise them, I don't acknowledge them. I don't have kind thoughts about them. I'm sure that you could mitigate the circumstances with the benefit of hindsight, but fuck that. No, bollocks. Yeah. So my mother escaped as soon as she could, and she went to London, and she took up nursing, and she became an incredible nurse who went on to an incredible career. One of, if not the most highly respected people in her field. She ended up having a string of letters after her name that are as long as the alphabet, and some really quite important jobs, did some important things. But she was the ultimate friend to the underdog. And she went through the full Hattie Jakes hospital career beginning. So she was a hospital matron, and every bit as formidable as the archetypal ones that you see in the Carry-On films and so on. If you were a good member of staff, she would be your best friend in the world. If you were a bad member of staff, God help you. God help you. She was also stunningly beautiful. She had an incredible body. It sounds a bit weird to say that about your own mother, but she was a really incredibly beautiful woman. And she was a free spirit, and she dressed according to the 60s. She wasn't afraid to flaunt her body, despite, or maybe even because of, I don't know, because of her history of sexual abuse. She was never afraid of her own sexuality, and she kind of embraced it and took control of it. And she would do things like, when she was working as a matron in the psych intensive care unit, she would be partying all night in the clubs and dancing half naked in cages and thoroughly enjoying herself, and then go straight on to work the next morning. And she always used to tell the stories that she'd be in charge of the psych intensive care unit, and 10 minutes after she got to work, then some people would come in under a section under the Mental Health Act, who she'd been at the party with like an hour and a half before, which is just so typical of her. So yeah, she was the ultimate professional. She was an amazing nurse. She was an absolute empath, champion of the underdog. She was also quite violent, again, possibly due to her background. Her nickname was Slosh, because when enraged, and like my father, she was never needlessly or inappropriately violent, unless you assume that all violence is inappropriate. What they both did was mete out justice where they felt that it was deserved. And so her nickname was Slosh, because she would give people one warning, and she would say that if you don't stop whatever or do whatever, I'm going to slosh you one. And then if they didn't, then she'd hit them. I'll tell you one story about her. My mother's passion was the elderly. Went on to become mine as well. And from her career, although she went down an occupational health route and a teaching route, her passion was always working with the elderly, especially with dementia and mental health in the elderly. And my God, was she the ultimate champion. And she was working at a hospital where it came to her attention that one of the sisters was mistreating one of the patients. And Mum was very careful. She got the evidence, and having got the evidence, before taking the evidence to anybody to have it dealt with professionally, she just waited for this sister out on the car park and broke her jaw, broke her nose, broke her arm, and broke a couple of ribs. And I'm not going to condone violence, of course I'm not, but, you know, fair play to her. Sorry, probably inappropriate. Okay, so I'm going to get on to the point where my parents first meet each other, and then I'm going to wrap this one up at that, because it's 25 to 1, and I need to get some supper. But this is a good story. It's so typical of them. So we're in Birmingham, and my mother was kind of the talk of the town. She was she was seen as very exotic, because of her colouring, because of the way that she dressed, because of the way that she looked. She was stunningly beautiful. And so she got to kind of hang out in the, you know, with the A crowd, if you like. And one of her places of choice was a place called the Elbow Room, which is where a lot of the local musicians used to hang out, the Hollies and so on. They all used to hang out there. And at this point, my mother was engaged to an exceedingly rich man, who literally owned a chateau, and he was from an incredibly rich family. I've missed out a bit. I've missed out the bit. You'll have to forgive me that a lot of this isn't clear in my mind. My mother had another child before me, my brother Mark, and she was committed to his father and vice versa. When she became pregnant, and certainly when she had the child, he was from, the father was from a wealthy and influential family, and his family put so much pressure on him that he was to have absolutely nothing to do with any of this. So poor old Mark kind of had a bit of a dodgy start to life, and his name was Mark with a C, the French Mark. So he was my half brother, and because of circumstances that prevailed at the time, my mum changed jobs, specifically because of having the child, and she applied for and got a job as matron of a girls' school, a very posh and expensive girls' school, and she applied for that job because she was promised accommodation with her child. And because when push came to shove, because she was half caste and because her child was somewhat of colour, it all fell through at the last minute, entirely down to racism. And despite her best endeavours, Mark was taken into care for a period, and it was during that period that my mother and father met. So let's get on to that. So we're back to the Elbow Room, and Mum is hanging out with all of her muso friends. At this point, she's become, I think they're engaged, to this another wealthy and influential guy who, by all accounts, was besotted by her. And his name was Graham. I've just remembered that. His name was Graham. And by all accounts, he wouldn't have let his family or anybody else put him off Mum. He was smitten, entirely smitten. And I don't think Mum was entirely averse to the idea either. And they were, whether they're engaged or not, they were certainly an established couple. And they were in the Elbow Room. And Graham, although he was rich and so on, he was his hobby was musicianing, being a musician. I can't remember what he played. He wasn't a vocalist. He played an instrument, and he was actually performing that night at the Elbow Room, and Mum was in the audience. And when she was at the bar, my father happened to be there that night. And at this point, my father is in his heyday as, I don't want to say all the things, but he was doing what he did in Birmingham with these people. Go and read the book if you want it. Just search for anything about Irish gangs and gang life in the late 60s and the late 60s, 1970, around Birmingham. You'll easily find him. So there they are, and they both happen to be at the bar. And my father, typically for him, and again, I'm going to look at this with hindsight. I know why he did it. He insulted her, and I know why he did it. Because of his inferiority complex, he would have looked at her, and she was so his type. My father was always entranced by the dusky beauty, was always his type. And credit to him, he loved my mother from the moment he set eyes on her. I was going to say to the moment that she died, but that's not true, because he loved her utterly beyond that. He loved her until the day that he died, and I'm pretty sure that they love each other now. Please God, I hope they do. So perhaps given that, and given that they spent their lives together in their own dysfunctional fashion, perhaps you'll excuse the story I'm about to tell you. Well, I've already started. So they're at the bar. He's insulted my mother. My mother has responded in intellectual kind, which took him by surprise. He would have thought, he would have looked at her, he would have thought, out of my league, so he would have insulted her. And I suspect that that's why he did it. I know he did it, I suspect that's why. She responded in an intellectual fashion which would have taken him by surprise and would have kind of jerked him out of that, and they started talking, and there was an instant connection there, and it was an intellectual connection because they were both intellectuals and they were both linguists. They both loved language, and I can imagine they spoke to each other in a way that they may not have encountered from other people. But there was also a physical connection. As I said, my father was always entranced by the dusky beauty, and he liked a good body. And my mother, now maybe this goes back to her childhood and the need for protection, but my mother was always attracted by, she needed the intellectual stimulus, but on a base level that she didn't always follow. She was always attracted by huge, strong men, maybe because on some base level she wanted that level of protection. My God, she got it with my father. So there was this immediate connection, and they chatted away, and the evening went on while Graham, poor sod, is musicianing for the pleasure of others. So the end of the night comes, and Graham has finished his musicaling, and he kind of comes over to claim his missus. And you get two different versions of this depending on whether you talk to my mother or my father. My father claims this never happened. My mother and everybody else who was there says, oh yeah, it did. It absolutely did. Graham came to claim his missus, and my father, not wishing to cause a fuss, said, look, I really am most awfully sorry about this, and this is terribly awkward, but I'm afraid that I'm going to take Anne home. And Graham sort of said, what? I don't know what's going on here, but no, this is my partner, fiance, whatever the words used were. What are you talking about? Don't be so silly. And my father said, yeah, I know. It's absolutely ridiculous. And I'm genuinely sorry about this, but I'm taking her home. And Graham made, I don't know how much more bluster went on, but Graham made the mistake of threatening my father, which any bloke would do. There's a guy there trying to take your woman. Of course you're going to. And my mother always gives him credit. My father did everything to not make this a violent encounter. But Graham kind of started, and my father hit him. And if my father hit you, then you were hit. More specifically, you would fly across the room and be unconscious for a while. And that's exactly what happened. Graham went to throw the first punch, which is unusual for my dad. My dad never let anybody else throw the first punch. He used to get in first and just finish it with one. But obviously in this case he was technically in the wrong. He didn't want it to escalate. Graham went to throw a punch and the old man just smacked him properly. So, bosh, across and down he went. He was out for the count for a while. And Dad grabbed hold of my mother, literally lifted her and said, come on. And my mother just about had time to grab a handbag. And he carried her down the stairs. It was an upstairs club. And his car was parked right outside the club. This was my dad, it was Birmingham. He could park where he wanted, do what he wanted, didn't need to lock the car. No need to worry about anything of that. And he opened the passenger seat, put my mother in there, put her handbag on her lap and said, stay there. Shut the door, went round, got in the driver's side. The car, if you're interested, I'm pretty sure it was a Bristol 404. Maybe it's a 403. It was definitely a Bristol. My father was into Bristols. In both senses. And what happened then was kind of amazing. My father drove my mother in the small hours of the morning from Birmingham to South Wales to the top of the family mountain where we are all scattered and which we owned. And he took her there, and throughout the night they talked and he recited poetry, and it's just the most magical story, really. And then when daylight came, he drove her back to Birmingham, and I strongly suspect that they podgered each other, but neither of them went into any details about that. And they were together from that moment on. And there you go. That's it for this first section of a potted history of boating. I'll try not to, I don't know if I'm even going to post this. I'll go through it and edit the bits that need to be edited and try and leave it as much as possible. And if I think that it's broadcastable, then it'll go out and there'll be more to come. And it's now 1:45. I need to get some supper. Did you enjoy that? Anyway, it is what it is. That was the beginnings of how I came to be, and if you would like, there will be more to come. But for now, cheers, thank you, Good night.